Light is everything in our photography, but we always have light. Or how would we ever capture an image? We don't want much photographers. We want sufficient light for our subject to give us that sparkling contrast and that vibrant colour, if colour is important to the shot. We want our highlights to just reach white and the shadows just touching black, so the image jumps from the screen from sheer photographic quality, even before we consider the content of the image. And we don't want any burnt out highlights or blocked up shadows. Now, how many images do you achieve for every 1,000 images you shoot? If you're using the fingers of more than one hand to count the images you shoot that fall into this category, then you're doing pretty well, and you're certainly doing better than I am. Image editing is part and parcel of the art of photography. It's where we balance the light to achieve what nature and our state-of-the-art digital cameras can't always deliver. And here we have another perfect example in a B-17 Flying Fortress shot at Duxford in the east of England on a less than perfect day. With the image opened up into Adobe Camera Raw, we're going to take this shot most of the way to a dramatic monochrome image using just the tools of Camera Raw, or most of the tools of Camera Raw. Let's enhance the good parts and either subdue or eradicate the bad parts and make the image pop. Here, I think it's both the subject matter and the lack of colour that pushes us towards a monochrome image. Now, we're heading for a monochrome conversion here, but I did notice something in the aircraft a little while ago when I zoomed in on it that may be interesting before we start. If I zoom into this area here, we have the perfect example of chromatic aberration, and there you can see it, cyan down one side of that antenna and magenta down the other. Let me drop that down just a little bit so it's sharper. There we go. Now, although we're going to be heading towards a monochrome, it may be a good exercise here to go to this option, our lens corrections, and tick this little box. And when I do, you can see how effectively Photoshop removes the chromatic aberration. Not a great problem for us converting to a monochrome, but if we were trying to push the colour in a colour shot from that position, we could make that chromatic aberration much worse. Now, I've said in the past that I very rarely check with the image this big on screen to make sure Photoshop does the job adequately, and now you can see why I tend to trust it pretty well. I'm going to hit Control 0. Let's make a start proper by going back to our basic tab, and I'm going to remove the saturation because that is my starting point. What I like about modern photography is how I can take a shot, see that I've got a bit of that information board sticking in on the bottom left, but not have to worry about it. We've also got a couple of modern cones here, and that is a bit surprising. We can remove them quite easily these days, but it's not the point. This is a historic airfield, a part of the Imperial War Museum, so you would think that if anyone was going to keep a scene authentic, it would be the Imperial War Museum Duxford. But no, they want to put bright orange and white road cones in a shot when it would never have been there originally. But as I said, we can take them out pretty easily. Looking at the image, I can't quite make up my mind if we need to straighten it just a little bit. I'm looking along the background on the left of the aircraft. On the right, it's a little bit misleading because we've got a low hill which is rising up, and I'm not entirely sure. So I think the best thing to do is to zoom in to that back area there, and we seem to have a straight line along there. I'm going to put my straightening tool along that edge, telling Photoshop that part needs to be straight. Control 0. Well, it's turned it a small amount, but we'll accept what it's given us because it looks a little better, I think. I think I can come up a little bit from the bottom and now you can see the aircraft is beautifully placed on that rule of thirds line. I certainly don't need quite as much sky at the top, so I can bring that down too to give us a little bit more of a panoramic shape. So I think we'll work forward from that point. Remember, this isn't cast in stone. We can come back and remove that crop or adjust it at any time, but to commit it to move on, we just touch the enter key, and now we can look at the second thing we want to do, and that is to give it a healthy slug of clarity. Mid-tone contrast. Now we're starting to see some rich blacks coming through, perhaps one or two too many, which we'll deal with in a moment. Now I will be keeping my eye on the histogram at the top of the screen, but it looks to be a pretty good spread of tones from left to right and a good peak upwards too. We could look at the whites a little bit, but I doubt they're going to make a great deal of difference to the aircraft, and I think when we come to dealing with the sky, we need to use our graduated filter. So I'm going to select the graduated filter, and I'm going to drag that down the screen from about that point, and you can see it will automatically pick up the last setting. A couple of tips here. If you want to reset all of those sliders, go inside the picture, right click, and you can reset the local settings. We can touch the V key to get rid of the bounding box, but everything is still working, so we're in a much better position here now to determine what we want to do and how much we want to move these sliders. Now I think we need to be pretty aggressive with this. I'd like to have lots of sparkle and clarity coming through. The one thing when we start to do that, if we're not careful, we can start to produce a bit of a halo around the aircraft, and that I think we've got to be aware of. Maybe if I just raise that a little bit at that point so that that halo is a little bit better. But maybe I could even choose to put another gradient on the top of the sky. So I've got one gradient that comes well down, but maybe another. Let's just click at this point and drag it down because we're not seeing the box. Let me hit the V key so you can see I've just made another gradient at the top. So if I wanted to give that a little bit more, I can do so. Maybe I'll even do one at the bottom as well to really push the interest way up into the aircraft. But now we've got some rather dark tones on the aircraft, and I'd like to lift some of those, particularly the logo on the fuselage, not for the reasons you may think, but they're good as any. So what I'd like to do next is to move up to this option, which is our adjustment brush. Now I'm going to zoom in on the aircraft. I want it to be fairly big on screen. Now you can see the brush that I've got here. If I take you down to the bottom of these options, we've got the size of the brush. Now we can adjust that exactly the same as we do in Photoshop with those square bracket keys to the right of the letter P. The flow is very important. We need to be quite delicate with this and always work on the low side, building up to a higher flow where we can get away with it. And we need to consider exactly what we're doing here. So I think to start with, looking at some of those dark tones at the bottom of the fuselage, I'm going to make my brush a bit bigger, and you'll notice that the inner ring and the outer ring have quite a large gap. What we are seeing there is the feather of the particular tool we're using, the softness from the inner ring towards the outer ring. If I drop the feather right down, there you can see the difference. But I think I quite like it to be fairly big. So I'm going to start to paint over this area, but of course we don't always see what we want to see because we've not made any adjustments over here yet. So I'm going to scroll back up. I'm going to reset all of these. I don't want to add any more clarity in there. I don't want to drop the exposure down. If anything, I want to bring the exposure up. Now you can see where my brush started to work there. Maybe I could look at the shadows, maybe just bring those up a little bit. But now I can continue working because now I've adjusted the sliders. I'm in a better position to just gradually lift some of those tones. Let me do some of this around the tyre and the wheel, and there you can see taking just a bit of time and trouble here to lift the tones in these strategic places. Now, unbeknown to you, I just got up from my chair and went and closed the blinds in the room I'm working in, because this is a particularly sunny day today, and what I noticed was I was having difficulty seeing these dark tones that I want to make a change to. And you can see I'm just lifting them a little bit, and I'm trying to be careful so that I need to only do it once. But we do need to bring up some of these tones, and you can see them lifting nicely underneath the wing. I'll hit Control 0, and you can see that we've done quite a bit in the bulk of the fuselage. Whoops, I made that a bit too big. And we need to work more onto the wing and onto the nose of the aircraft. So zooming in again to the wing, we can carry on that work. The beauty of working this way, of course, is that once we get the masking done, because that's what we're doing, it's the equivalent of masking in Photoshop, we can always make an adjustment on the density if we feel we've gone a little too far, or maybe we feel we can squeeze a little more. Under there, I think I'll just lift the tones a little bit, and now I'm just holding the space bar, clicking and dragging along the fuselage to the business end. So we'll just lift the tones around here. I'll avoid going over the glass dome or the perspex dome at the front, I think. I don't know though, perhaps a wipe or two. If we go too far or we don't like what we've done, we can always come back, but I suppose there is a nice little bit of light sparkling through there. And we do have to concentrate on the lady, of course. Now, when we get to areas like the top here and the top turret, then this is probably the time to zoom in even bigger, maybe make the brush smaller, and just take that little bit of extra care. But as you can see, with that lovely soft edge, it's not that difficult to do. But I think we've probably done enough. And if I just do this last little bit, I'll zoom out and we'll have a little bit of a time out, I think. Now the area over here, the light area, I'd like to do a little bit of work on that. So I'm going to zoom in a bit, get that nice and large. I've still got my tool selected, but I do want to select a new option here because I want to make a new brush adjustment. So I can brush over this area, but I don't want to lighten that, I want to darken it. So I'll drop the shadows down and drop the exposure down a little bit and the highlights down a little bit. Now you can see we've got quite a bit of density here. Whether we've got too much, well, let's try it and see. Let's just start to brush over this area. And you can see it's coming down rather fast and probably a little too much. So we'll back off a little bit and we'll back off the highlights a little bit. And we'll be a little more careful with our work. I'm just brushing over these one brush at a time because we are in a position here where we could suddenly start to see the effects of our work. Just one brush and evaluate, one brush and evaluate, and when you get to the right down to the edges here, then we need to be even more careful. And I usually find the bigger brushes work better here. Let's hit Control 0, that looks okay, bit more around there. Maybe we can just touch one or two of these others using the same brush just to take some of those tones down, especially in areas where they're near the edge. That looks pretty good. Now the aircraft is a pretty impressive aircraft, so we are naturally drawn to that. But a couple of things I'd like to do. I'd like to lighten the ground just around the foreground here to just draw us in even more strong. And we've got some light tones with the lady on the fuselage, and I would like to raise those as well. So once again I would be selecting to make a new adjustment brush, zooming in to the lady in question, and what we're going to do here is just make a couple of brush strokes, but what I want to do is to raise the highlights, maybe raise the exposure just a little bit. I just want to give a little bit more emphasis on the motif because it is a very strong point on the fuselage, and as you can see with that soft edge brush, very quick and easy to do. And I've said this in other videos too, that quite often, and in this case I think we're proving it, it's not one change that really is significant, it's a series of smaller changes. Each one of them in their own right are not strong. Now those pins are getting in the way a little bit, so I'll just touch the hand tool, the pins will disappear. Now you can see how the motif is jumping off the front of that fuselage very nicely. Do we want to do the same with the number and the star on the back? Probably not, because I think this is the focal point at the front end. But moving back to my brush again and making sure I've got new, I'm just going to give this a little bit of lightness around here too. Now it's doing what I want to do with the settings I used a few moments ago. So you can see what I'm looking for here, just a little bit round here. Just to lift it, help our eyes to focus on that point, almost like putting a spotlight on the aircraft from above. So I think we've done quite a bit here, and I'm willing to move on to Photoshop. Remember though, at any time we can always come back, because I'm going to be opening this as a smart object. But I think this is a time for another 2-minute timeout. Is there anything we need to do here before we move away from Camera Raw into Photoshop? One thing I'd like to take a look at, I'm going to double click the zoom tool, bring the image up to 100%. Give it just a second to sharpen up. I just want to have a look at the pixels, and they're looking pretty good in the sky. And I'm looking in the dark tones. There's not a great deal of evidence of the work we've done, but there's a little bit under here. Remember, you're looking at a slightly compressed video, so you may not be seeing quite the detail I am, but you will be able to see this image when we complete it. Full resolution, I'll include it with the download. What I think I'll do is go to my detail option here and just add a little bit of luminance, probably no more than about 20. Now I can see the difference when I double click and step that up. I can see just a nice difference, but without seriously affecting the quality or the sharpness of the image. So I'm going to accept that. And now we've got an image which is jumping off the page. I think because we've cropped the image within Camera Raw, there may be one thing I could do. I'm going to pick up this option, the radial filter. You can see I've just drawn out that shape. Right click and choose to reset the local correction. Hit the V key, so I've got everything in place but no changes. If I take you down to the bottom here, you'll see the feather. I'm going to push way up, and I'm just going to drop the exposure a little bit around the edges just to push our focus in to the center. Now I think I've got the strong tones that I was looking for. I'm hopeful I've got the sparkle I'm looking for, but I'm just going to take a couple of minutes time out before I click to open this up into Photoshop. Now after having a 2-minute timeout in Camera Raw and just looking at the image, I did make just 1 or 2 small changes. I changed my mind about those symbols at the back of the plane, and I did use an adjustment brush just to lift the tones a little bit. I lifted the tones a little more on the symbol of the young lady on the front and some of the glass areas, including the turret and even the wheel rims, just to give that little bit of extra sparkle. But now we have the image open, we've got to turn our attention to the distractions, which are the cones and that problem in the bottom left. Now of course we're going to have difficulty editing a smart object. Now we can rasterize the smart object, and we should be saving this, which I'll do in a moment, but I think what I'll do is I will just do a straight copy of that, Control J, and then I will right click and choose to rasterize that layer. So I've got my cake and I can eat it too. I've got my smart object should I decide I need to go back into Camera Raw, but I've also got a layer that I can continue to do the manipulation and get rid of those distractions on. But I really should be saving this, so I'm going to save it before we pick up the tools to fix the problem at the bottom left. And the tools we're going to use for that are going to be content aware, I think. In the last video on this particular set, I believe when I picked up a selection tool, and I'll use the polygonal lasso here, I just hit the delete key after making a selection, but we can't do that here. And I'll demonstrate why. Because we've got both of our layers, this layer isn't a background layer and it's not locked. So if I try to hit the delete key and then flood with content aware, I need to turn that bottom layer off because I have just hit the delete key. That's what happens. So what we need to do, I'll go to Control Z. In this situation we need to go to Edit, Fill, and choose our content aware from here. Control D, and that looks a pretty good repair to me. Now normally I would turn my attention to these using the spot healing brush, but the content aware is becoming so good at doing what we need to have done that I'm going to try it here too. Let's pick up the polygonal lasso tool. I'm going to keep the selection reasonably tight. I find that it tends to work pretty well. Once again, Edit, Fill, Content Aware. Control D will remove the selection, and that's pretty good too. Turning our attention to the one at the end. The problem with this one I noticed earlier on is it goes so close to that rope line there, but let's just use the same options here. Polygonal. I'm pretty certain it will do a good job, but if it doesn't matter really, does it? Because all we do is we choose a different tool and come at it from a different angle. Edit, Fill, Content Aware. Well, not too bad. Probably it could do with one or two touches with the spot healing brush. Not too keen on that light line there, so we'll remove that, and a couple of touches down here. If the spot healing brush doesn't do the job you want it to do, I sometimes find that the healing brush does, where you can actually take a clone source. Not always, but sometimes it does, and we're dealing with an image very big here, and I think once we zoom out I don't think we're going to have any problems in that area at all, because all of the focus is on the front of the aircraft. Now, flush with the success of that content aware tool for those three distractions, I'm tempted to have a go at this one here. I don't think it's crucial, but if we could remove that fence line, that would be quite nice, I think. Now, I'm not really certain how it's going to cope with this, but let's give it a try. Once again, I'll use the polygonal lasso. I think if we go along that line there and down here and edit, fingers crossed as we hit the fill, and OK. Control D. It's not perfect, but it's so close to the edge that I think I would probably live with that. I may do just a couple of little touches to it. I think maybe this is the time to pick up my clone tool. Now, if you're a bit worried about using the clone tool, you can always clone to a new blank layer. But after a while, I think, like me, you'll be pretty confident, and all I wanted to do was to put that line straight across there. That tidies that up a little bit. Maybe just remove that one and switch to the spot healing brush, small brush just to deal with that line there, couple of touches. I don't think we're going to have any problem with that whatsoever in the context of our virtually completed image. Now we've got this saved on our computer. We've got a smart object and we've got our image we're working on above it. I think I'm pretty confident now to say with that one saved, I'm going to flatten this because I'm pretty confident I don't want to go back into Camera Raw. What I may do is just look at maybe just adjusting the clouds just a little bit. I'm going to turn to my burn tool and we can give ourselves a bit of belt and braces here. I'm just going to make a quick copy of this, Control J, because sometimes when I'm doing this work I like to do it on another layer. It gives me the choice of dropping it in the bin if it all goes pear-shaped, but it also gives me the opportunity to just flick from the before and after, and I can evaluate that the changes I've made are either positive or negative. So I'm going to make my brush fairly big. I think the exposure needs to be lower than that. Let's see if I can get that down to 5%. And all I'm going to do here is to, I need to select shadows from the range, and I just want to do a little bit of work. You can see it's very delicate, but I'm just darkening down those clouds a little bit, just to make them just a little more threatening. And I think it's in keeping with the subject. I'll drop that down a bit more. There's always a danger that we go too far here, so we need to be careful. Don't use a brush too small. You'll find that in these situations, the bigger the brush, the easier it is to work with, strange as it may sound. Now we've got a little bit of a distraction at the top left, so I'll just take that right down and away, and maybe that little dark, that little light area there, just to hold the top of the image in nice and solid. Now looking around the image, I'm happy with that, but let's take a look at what we've done here. Are we happy with that? Yes, I am. So I'm going to move on now with this image. But we've got a few little areas now where there's just a couple of little white highlights, which they're not significant, but being a finicky devil, I am going to put them right. So simple matter, spot healing brush, zoom in down the bottom, just the light catching these little flecks of whatever they are sitting in the concrete, but sometimes they can distract us. The best way I find to do this is to Control 0, have a look around, zoom in on the bits that I think I want to deal with, and deal with them, zoom out again, go back in, there's a little puddle there, let's get rid of that, that's not doing anything for us. Couple there as well, there's one there, and that little highlight there. Now, Control 0 once again, you can see we've got no distractions into the picture and to our flying fortress. Now, it's not generally a great idea to evaluate your own photographs, especially when we're so close to completing something like this, because it's not until we've looked at it a few times over a few days will we decide whether we're happy with the final result or not. But I think I've achieved something with a bit of impact and drama. I think taking that sky down does give it a threatening appearance, and the content of the image, I think, lends itself well to that. And as I always say, a little bit unfair to do what I'm about to do, but we'll take a look at the original image in colour and our monochrome. I think the best way I could describe the manipulation we've done here is we've been aggressive with the manipulation, and in some instances it's not a good thing to be aggressive, of course, but in others it is. Now, it's okay to be aggressive with our manipulation as long as we started off with an image that was very well exposed to start with. Now, I don't think we could have got the exposure much better on this particular aircraft under those conditions, and that has allowed me to push those sliders and do quite a bit of manipulation to create our monochrome.